We're human, don't you know, just like you are. Welcome to season two, maybe the difficult second book. In these coming recordings, we're talking leadership in all of its complicated glory. Leadership and dot, dot, dot. Room for a variety of topics and perspectives to consider for your own leadership experience and growth. And to kick us off, I am really delighted to welcome James Horne, with 30 years of corporate experience, along with creating his own business, leading to the UK's #1 selling salad dressing. More on that later. It's fair to say he's had a varied career. Fast forward to now, though, and James thrives on coaching and mentoring, so a man after my own heart, empowering individuals and entrepreneurial organisations, I'm going to be saying that word a lot today, to exceed their expectations, and recently became a professional implementer of EOS, EOS. And again, more on that when we get to the proud plugs at the end. So for now, as I stated, we are talking entrepreneurship, a word I like but hate typing. So grab a cuppa and we'll get started. A warm welcome to you, James. And first things first, let's just define entrepreneurialism.
Oh, good afternoon, Rachel. Entrepreneurialism is all about just running your own business and coming up with an idea and making it happen. And I think that's certainly what I've found during my career is best describing that wonderful word. Starting a business, realizing where you're trying to go to and trying to work it all out is the key. And I think a lot of people have that natural ability to really want to sell something and to make it and enjoy running the business. I guess there's lots of people who don't like doing that. But the sector I've been in is very much enjoying running your own businesses and indeed dealing with all the challenges, of which there are a huge number.
Yeah, so I sort of link this back to leadership, I guess. And I know when we had our sort of intro call to set this up, we were talking about leadership and entrepreneurialism. And I think in my head, I'm like, okay, so I have this sort of assumption that leaders should have an element of entrepreneurialism, but I have a problem reconciling that all entrepreneurs should be leaders. Where's your take on either of those?
That's fascinating, really, because I think to create a business, you do have to be a leader as well, because you need to lead people with towards your vision. And having a vision and being able to express what that vision is to all of the people that are working with you is really important. And that's a leadership skill as much as being an entrepreneur. I think being an entrepreneur is all about having some great ideas. But funnily enough, as I've gone through my career more recently, as you mentioned in your intro, I became an EOS implementer, a professional implementer of this most wonderful business system that I use and is used widely throughout the world now. And what's really interesting is that you have in many businesses a visionary who's very often the entrepreneur. And then you have what we call an integrator, who is the person that provides the glue that brings all the people in your organization together. So you could argue to develop, your thoughts about, leader versus entrepreneur, that in fact, the integrator very often is the leader, and the visionary may well be the focal point of the business with all the great ideas flying at 30,000 feet. Perhaps the person with all the top relationships with key customers. But the trouble is, with a visionary, very often you find that they've got all of these ideas, and if you let them just run the business, you'll be lurching from one crisis to the next, as you don't actually bring together the core components, the key components that you need in order to run the day-to-day business. And so that difference between visionary and entrepreneur and an integrator is really, I think, quite important.
Yeah, and I suppose it's that recognizing, isn't it, when you get to the sort of size or you get to the sort of stage in creating the business, that you need that help. You need that maybe that's not a strength of yours. You are the ideas person. you do suffer a little bit from shiny new thing syndrome, and therefore keeping that focus on that first thing that you know is going to be successful if you put the work into it is really hard, because you've just seen something else, you've had another idea. Recognizing that, you know, you can't really be the lone ranger and maintain and sustain a long-term successful business proposition. Where do you see that happen? I mean, I can think of, I can count them quite easily, actually. There's some small business owners that I know who are really visionary and really determined to make things work. They're integrating for themselves. They're trying to do everything and be everything. So they've got that kind of, what's it called, a Lone Ranger complex, that I've got to do it all myself. How often do you see that? And what do people need to do to get themselves out of that headspace?
Well, it's interesting. The number of times I've felt there in my career that I'm suddenly doing tasks that actually aren't what I'm good at. And, you know, you might have created this business, and I really enjoy the creation of the business. I love the product, but I'm now spending all my time managing people, managing finance aspects, and managing things that perhaps I'm not great at. And that's one of the things that when you're sort of trying to distinguish between your role as an entrepreneur and your role as a leader, you need to maybe take a couple of steps back and then just identify actually what the key roles you are expecting of the entrepreneur, and indeed what the key roles you are expecting of the integrator or the leader. So, for example, people, it's a statistic that I make up on the spot, but let's just say over 80% of all your problems in any business is managing people.
Probably a fair assessment. It might be more than that.
Yeah, I mean, every bit of research you ever see is always people. Now, managing people is something that some entrepreneurs may not be very good at. They may not actually like doing it. And therefore, you need to then have a business structure within your leadership team where you can allocate the roles to best suit the personalities within that leadership team. So, and one of the things that I've often found quite amusing is that, you know, when you have a vision, you assume in your business that everybody else understands that vision. And of course, it doesn't. They don't. And in fact, you know, there's a lot of research which says that you need to tell someone 7 times before they actually get it. And so when you told them the 4th time, you just have to sort of pinch yourself and say, I've only got 3 more to go, and then maybe they get it. But actually being able to convey that vision to people does require, maybe within your management team, a structure which is best suited to the qualities that you as the entrepreneur have. And as I say, I can often remember in my early days of running a business, there was a time when we actually had a venture capital interest in the business. But I was still the only person that was qualified to drive the fork truck and the fork truck driver. And I remember sitting there saying, somebody knocking on the door and saying, James, there's a lorry that needs unloading. And I had this very expensive man sitting the other side of the desk. And so I had to go dashing out. And I'm so embarrassed by that, looking back on, you know, how stupid that was and how I hadn't organized things. But so, you know, really just creating and understanding what role you've got to perform, and indeed making sure that we have a structure within your leadership team that allocates those roles correctly, I think starts to enable you to create other leaders.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, for me, the most satisfying thing I've done in all my business over the last 40 plus years is seeing people do things that they didn't think they could ever do. And you do that through, obviously, training programs and management skills and what have you. And being able to talk to people who said, you know, I never believed I could ever do this job, after they're doing it now extremely competently. For me, that is the most satisfying thing about running any business. And that's the thing that I think gives more joy. It's not all about the rewards of having a successful business. It's actually the rewards of working with the people.
Yeah, I
So
think you're right. You're right. And ultimately, your people will make or break your business. I mean, nothing can cock up a good business more than not engaging and having your people actively disengaged. I mean, let's face it, they can do so much damage should they feel it. And it will be intentional, but it will happen through apathy, through just feeling maligned, feeling out of place, feeling disengaged, or not understanding the purpose. I think I was reading James Very. I'm going to hold this up, and for the purpose of the recording, the audio recording, it's a book, by the way. James Very, great. I'm very grateful you sent me a copy of Traction, which is Gina Wickman, who's the guy behind EOS, isn't he? And
yes.
there's a piece in there around, ask people in an organization what the organization's purpose is, and you'll quite probably get lots of different answers because it will be their perspective, the purpose through their different lenses, or as they've heard it from others, or as they understand it. The organizations that get it really right is you'll notice the answers are broadly the same. They know which way they're going. And it takes me back to somebody giving me an analogy around two chaps chipping stones in the quarry, and you ask one what he's doing, he says, I'm chipping rocks, that's what I'm doing. And you ask the second, he says, I'm building a cathedral. So one with a massive sense of importance and purpose, knowing his little piece in the bigger puzzle, and the other one, I'm chipping rocks. And that stuck with me for years. I mean, I heard it 10, 15 years ago, and it's just stayed with me on that, what are you doing? Who is the end customer? Who's getting what it is from this business? For you, when you were actually, you cast your mind back to salad dressing days, and you were building that business, and you were in your kitchen creating this. The sort of first few people that started working with you when you did start getting offered the forklift or whatever you needed to do to take yourself out of that sort of more rolling your sleeves up and managing space. What did you do to engage them with that overall purpose? I mean, was it a building the cathedral moment? We're going to be the best salad dressing in the country, or what was your vision then? What was your purpose?
One of the things that is so important with people is getting your culture, and you can define your culture by identifying really what the core values are of your business. And in the food business, one of the core values was actually understanding, having an appreciation of really good tasting food. And if you can actually get everybody to be on the same page with that, that was very much a start as to how we created our food business, which started in the kitchen sink. We were making a few jars of mustard, and I used to take them down to London and sell them to friends and what have you. And the next thing I knew, I was sitting in the guard's van with hundreds of jars as I took them to the car, and we started making more and more. And before we knew it, we'd created quite a big business. We started, Pizza Express salad dressing, which went on to become the UK's #1 selling salad dressing. And part of the vision that we gave people was things taste great. That was the real essence of how we managed to start to get people to helping us move in the right direction with how that business grew. I mean, we ended up with producing hundreds of products. What really is fascinating in that area is actually different people have different tastes, of course, otherwise we'd all be eating the same food.
Yes.
But so we ended up having, speciality people who, could detect salt, could detect rancidity in oil and so on. So again, this was actually a management process as well to actually identify who these people were, because some of them were very reluctant to come forward necessarily, but actually had an extremely powerful palate. So finding out those, innate talents that individuals have within your team is really important, and it can often come out of the blue. And I'm sure you say very often it's the person who's the quietest in the room is quite often got the best point of view on a particular issue. And so that ability to reflect your core values and ensure that people can see where you're going. And indeed, one of the things through EOS that we do is, when we're identifying their vision as to the direction you're going, identification of what those core values are is really vital. And we have a very simple process when we start to then look at the people within your organization. And I run this system in our own company and have done for 4 years, so I know it works. So this is not something that is just reading out of a textbook. And Gina Wickman, who created EOS and who wrote Traction and many other books, was absolutely clear that with getting everybody to reflect your core values. And as you say, everybody pointing in the same direction. So if you're cutting stones, you're all making a cathedral, not just chipping stones.
Yeah.
But everybody understanding those core values, and then just looking at your people and asking yourself, do they meet that core value? Yes, or plus minus, or no. And going down, then let's just say you identify 3, 4, 5 core values, and you put all your people down in a little matrix. So you actually just start ticking and identifying whether they meet those values. What we add on to that is, do they get it? Do they want it? And do they have the capacity to be able to do it? And obviously you have to tick those boxes. Very often you find that people do get it, but they may not want it. Yeah. Therefore, you do have to ask that question, are they the right people? Because the central thing we do around vision and people is actually identify whether the right people in the right seats. Yeah. And it's quite often you find that your most loyal people, some of them, they may reflect the core values, but they may not be in the right seat. But worse still, what we quite often find is that there are people within your organization that are the right that they are in the right seat, but they are the wrong people. In other words, they don't reflect your core values. And what they're actually doing is chipping away at your culture within the team and undermining where you go. And so we've done this in our own businesses and started to get everybody onto the same page. So you're all rowing in the right direction.
Yeah, so well, that's a win-win, isn't it? I mean, that's a win-win for the organization, because the teams, the employees, the partners, the whatever you call your colleagues, are sharing in the values of the organization. They feel it. To them, it's very aligned. It's very, and that's very engaging, isn't it? That's very motivating. But also for the individuals, will want to join an organization that shares their values or demonstrates their values. So it's attractive as well as retentive, isn't it? That's the lovely thing about it. And I suppose you're right, when you get those, when you have maybe the right people with the right skills, but they don't share the values, so they could do a great job, but they're choosing maybe not to, just because their heart's not in it, their head's not in it, they just don't really want to be there doing that thing right now. That can be quite insidious, can't it? And it can be sometimes quite low key and quite difficult to put your finger on to start with. It's hard to notice until you kind of really get behind the nuts and bolts of it and spot it. Something has just popped into my head, actually. I've been reminded of thinking about, I know we're talking about entrepreneurs becoming leaders, but there's also this piece where leaders become entrepreneurs in some ways. So they've been maybe in a leadership position in a certain organization, they've been promoted through, they may have been innovative and creative in some ways within that space, but ultimately a lot of the things that they've been doing have been a collaborative effort and all that kind of stuff within their organization. They then leave that organization and launch a business. They've had an idea, they're launching something. So they are showing that level of entrepreneurialism, but it's not a strong, lots of ideas version of entrepreneurialism, of that creativity and innovation. They're not the Elon Musk who's doing something new every 2 years. It's something else again. When they get, I'm reminded of this kind of double S curve of when your product's gone so far, you're like, okay, so now what? Because you kind of got to keep, is it going to be completely forever? No product really, you could say, lasts entirely forever. Well, they would argue that Marmite's close. But thinking of the next thing, how do you keep up with the markets? How do you keep on top? How do you stay ahead, or at least to be relevant and to be successful? If you don't have that creative spirit and that innovative spirit, do all leaders have to have that? Or is that something they then, like you would outsource your integration, do you outsource your visionaries?
Well, that's a really interesting point, because one of the things you have to embrace when you've talked about what the core values of the organization is actually, where is the organization trying to get to? Because if you don't have, for example, say a 10-year target as to where you're trying to build this business to, your staff don't understand where you're going. So one of the things, again, that we work on very much is identifying what your 10-year target is, what's your 3-year picture, and what's your 1-year plan. So in other words, if you want to increase your business by a factor of 10 in 10 years' time, what have you got to be doing in 3 years' time to be able to reflect that? And indeed, paint a picture to people as to how that's actually going to look. So, for example, you might, well, if you're going to double or treble the size of the business in 3 years' time, you might well then have to have different offices, for example. You might well have to have more staff. You might have to have a broader organization. And it's really vital, I think, to paint the picture as to where you're trying to get to, and indeed ensure that those stepping stones then are logical and achievable in order to reach that long-term target. And very often you will go into and talk to an organization and they won't have any idea what their long-term target is. So they might say, well, I want to sell it eventually, that sort of comment, but sell it for what and when and how big and so on. And actually getting people to understand what it is and then being able to convey that to the rest of the organization, that then drags you into the next stage of being able to achieve your real vision for that organization. And that requires both entrepreneurial skills and leadership skills to be able to deliver and manage that process. And one of the things you said, which I find and have found over the years really interesting, is we've employed a number of people who have come out of the armed forces. And of course, very often in the armed forces, you get real true leadership taught in a very different sort of spectre of activity. But quite a number of armed forces personnel have been really, really good at managing people, but then embracing that vision. Now, whether they are entrepreneurial very much depends on the individual themselves. But the ability to think laterally and to effectively have the helicopter vision of actually looking down on what you're doing. A lot of army personnel I've found have been really good at that. But happen to go into the forces at an earlier stage of their career, but actually are very, very good at running businesses. And only very recently, I was working with one who was exceptional. So it is quite interesting to see this career path that very often people take before they become what you might even refer to as entrepreneurial.
And it's funny, isn't it? You just really beautifully demonstrated how you cannot ever really assume anything about anyone. You could assume that somebody coming out of the military has been very used to working in a very structured way and doing as they're told, because at a lot of levels in that organization, there is an element of you do as you're told, and the thinking is happening elsewhere in some ways and in some areas, depending on your level, I guess, and depending on the level of command maybe that you've had or thinking that you've had to do. But it kind of struck me while you were talking about, we've been looking at entrepreneurialism on quite a grand level, at the one that drives everything, the one that creates the organization. Actually, it appears, doesn't it, in every little level through, because ultimately when you have this vision and everybody gets it, everybody knows where they're going, you've then got the kind of entrepreneurial creativity and innovation that comes from how you do it and how you do all the different bits, how all the different cogs function. So you'll have someone in IT that has a great idea about some software you could use and goes out and finds something new, and you'll have somebody in, I don't know, HR that has a great idea about how to engage and put some ideas out to staff. Or it may actually be somebody who's doing something really quite mundane and basic that has a spark of an idea and puts it in the suggestion box if there's one such a thing exists. And so it can happen at any point, can't it? And I'm thinking about the role of a leader and the role of the visionary to encourage that style of thinking from across the whole organization. So it's not all on them to come up with every answer, to come up with every new idea. Actually, it's encouraging a culture of creativity beyond that. What does that look like in the structures that you've been involved with so far?
Well, it's quite interesting because virtually every level of any business, each manager of whatever level is probably dealing with 136 issues at any one time. And certainly through EOS, that's how we've sort of started to segment how people deal with those issues. And what we've found is that by dividing the business or your organization into 6 key components, which are vision, people, data, process, issues, and what we call traction, almost every single one of those 136 issues will fall into the root cause of one of those 6 key components. And so the management of issues is actually how you evolve a effective and fast-moving business. And that ability to be able to handle issues, identify what the issues are, discuss them and solve, but something we call IDS, is really effective, because what we tend to find is that with issues, people will very often identify an issue, but it's actually not the real issue. So we have a process that we deploy where you will sit and you will every time you've got an issue, you will put it onto the issues list. You then identify what are the most important issues on that list. So you'll go for the first, second, and third. You'll then discuss whether that issue on the issues list is actually the real issue that you're dealing with. You very often find there's probably half a dozen other issues on your issues list that are actually all part of the same problem. And then you spend time identifying it, discussing it, and then above all, coming up with a resolution. And it's that discipline. And one of the things that, we do 3 things really with EOS is we ensure that you get your vision, so everybody actually understands where you're trying to get to and how you're going to get there. We instill what we call traction by implementing accountability and discipline to ensure that, again, people are executing that vision and getting it on the ground. And then, of course, making a business healthy. Now, so much effort has, of course, gone into, quite rightly, mental health at work, but actually working healthily is vitally important. And I'm sure in the past we really didn't recognize this. The idea of working 18 hours a day seemed to be cool. That was actually what people were being expected to do. Of course, that's not cool. And you don't need to do it like that. So one of the things that we like to see is open and honest organizations. And when one talks about being open and honest, it's actually having the courage and encouraging your staff to be able to say, well, look, this is an issue. We need to deal with it. Often people are frightened of actually conveying and suggesting they've got a genuine issue that they need to deal with. So one of the very much central parts of EOS is that definition of issues, and then the structure within the week and within your meeting structures as to how you deal with those. So it is a fascinating process because, as I said earlier, everybody's got hundreds of issues, and it's a question of actually bringing them down to the ground and actually trying to resolve them.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I thought about asking you, actually, just because it's something I've fallen prey to in the early days of my own business, and I do know entrepreneurs that have fallen into the same, let's call it a trap, I guess, particularly with startups, particularly something new. You put a lot of energy, blood, sweat, and tears, quite often literally tears, into that business, into that that getting things up and running. But ultimately, you recognize eventually that there's a difference between plugging away till something works and flogging the dead horse. Now, that's at the point where we use that horrible word pivot, or adjust, or evolve, or whatever it happens to look like. And I'm thinking of, actually, it takes me back to the examples of things like Blockbuster. They had opportunities, they had chances to evolve and do something different, but they carried on flogging the dead horse, and lo and behold, they went out of business. So big example. But I think there's a lot of little startups that probably fall into that trap of being so passionate, so in love with the thing that they've created. It's their baby, it's their life for such a long time to get up and running. But either the market just isn't there, consumers aren't getting it, something's going wrong, something's just not working in some way. Or ultimately, the worst thing is it's not a viable business proposition. It's not a sustainable business. Have you come across that? And then obviously, I think in my head, I'm thinking, well, there's a job for coaching. There's a job for helping that person come to grips and then do something about it in a healthy way, in a way that leaves them mentally stable. What's your experience of that? And I suppose it might be a slightly quirky thing to the EOS model to deal with, but ultimately, I think for anyone that's in that coaching and mentoring space, it must be something you come across every now and again.
Absolutely. I mean, we all know that the vast number of entrepreneurial startup businesses will fail within the first 3 years of their existence. And that failure is often for a multitude of reasons. And, clearly being in a business sort of selling typewriters to youngsters nowadays would clearly not work. EOS.
The quirky ones maybe, but not that many, no.
Indeed, yeah. Well, and EOS works in virtually any business that is entrepreneurial, and our sweet spot is entrepreneurial businesses employing between 10 and 250 people. So it doesn't matter what you're doing, whether you're in the restaurant business or whether you're producing widgets, or there's an enormous spectrum of businesses where it actually works. Clearly, if the business is not selling the right product into the right market, we've got your one's got a problem. And of course, it doesn't take long to identify that. Primarily, you run out of sales. You're not going to sell anything, so you can't make anything. But what we tend to find in many businesses is that it is actually the structure of the organization which is actually preventing it achieve the success it can. So you could have a wonderful sales department and you could have a competent operations department, but if you've got an incompetent finance department who aren't actually looking after the money of all the efforts that the sales and the ops have been doing, then your business won't work. And of course, that's exactly the same if you don't have a good sales team, but you've got a good ops team and a good finance team, you still won't work. So one of the things that we do, and we work very closely with the leadership team, is to identify what are the key roles and what are you expecting within that structure. We do not necessarily identify people within that process. So you're identifying roles. And getting those roles and responsibilities clearly defined at a very, very early stage is then key. And sometimes what we tend to find is that actually you've got people duplicating roles. So you've got a team which is particularly strong in one area, but less strong in others. And therefore, part of that process is making you 100% strong in every aspect of your business. So, that's part of the process. Very few great ideas fail because they are just completely wrong. That's quite unusual. Most of them fail because they run out of money. That's normally the issue, which is cash flow and being incorrectly funded, and or inappropriately funded or unable to generate those funds. But again, one of the things that is central to any entrepreneur is actually having a good understanding as to how you're going to finance what you're going to do. Yeah. And I know in my own experience of running our own food business, we grew and grew. And of course, providing the major multiples who like to pay you in the most delayed fashion as they can possibly
90 days at least, if not more. Yeah.
They 90 plus 2. I mean, I
always
remember
love the phrase of 90 plus 2. Like, why the plus 2? Come on, that's just being stingy.
Well, frankly. Indeed, but I remember we would be supplying in our 10th shipment into a multiple before we got paid for the first one. And it's extraordinary how often they were actually expecting us to be their bank. You're a relatively small organization in compared to them. But that's very much the issue. And some great businesses just simply run out of cash. But again, then maybe taking a couple of steps back and saying, well, do I actually want to be a £10 million business with a 25% margin, or do I want to be a £100 million business with a 2.5% margin? Yeah, it's all a question of scale, and then actually sitting back and saying, well, what do you want to be? And I mentioned, being a healthy business. It's not healthy, and I'm sure many entrepreneurs can relate to it, but working 18 hours a day is not healthy. Yes, of course, you can do it for a while, and very often you have to do it in order to make the business take off. But the art is to then have a structure that creates a healthy business. And one of the other things which I think a lot of people often need reminding is that maybe you create a business with an objective one day of selling it, but you've got to remember you've got to enjoy the journey to achieving that objective. And if you're not enjoying that journey, you're going to waste n number of years of your life being pretty miserable or fed up or irritated with frustration, not being able to achieve your goal. So it's absolutely essential to enjoy the journey. And if that means maybe dialing back your ambition a little bit to ensure that your business is cost effective, well run, well structured, then that's very much what an entrepreneur should be thinking about doing. And that's where the relationship between the entrepreneur and, say, the leader, if that is a separate, two separate entities, is really important. And being more pragmatic is, I think, a vital thing. And of course, very often an entrepreneur is not pragmatic because they're shooting for the sky.
And I was just going to say, we have these, sounds like there's this sort of almost like a handbook of afflictions that true entrepreneurs probably do suffer from. One of them being that overexcitement, sometimes that dogged determination to make something work regardless, maybe the inability to separate themselves from the role, from the business, so that they are their business as opposed to they're the person creating and running the business. But that sense of identity is so intertwined with it that it's messy. That potential lack of trust, maybe, and I do see that actually a lot with not just entrepreneurs, but leaders in general, where they don't want to let go, and trust enough in others to make things happen for, again, their baby. They don't want to hand their baby over to somebody else, and yet they know that they're failing said baby because they can't do everything and be everything for everyone. So what else would you add to that list that I think any entrepreneurs listening to this, which I hope there'll be a few, or budding entrepreneurs, need to just watch out for? Have that little bit of self-awareness. We think about these mental filters that we all have that stop us being overwhelmed with all the information in the world. Let's open a few of them up and say, just look out for these. Any more that you kind of go, actually, it's really common, here's one to look out for, or here's a couple to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have this most wonderful book, How to Be a Great Boss, and it's written by Gina Whitman, who created EOS. And it is a fantastic book about explaining the difference between a visionary and an integrator, and getting you as a person to really start to understand what you're good at, and recognizing both your strengths and indeed, and possibly even more importantly, your weaknesses, to try and ensure that then you have a team structure that actually everybody's good at what they're doing. And that sounds so simple, but actually running a business is incredibly simple. It's only us who make it complicated.
Yeah.
And that's one of the joys. When you've done it a few times, you begin to realize that actually it's not as complicated as people would like to make out. Of course, some of the more recent technology-driven businesses, we have an internet-based business, have become much more complex as suddenly the whole map of where you're going can change as a result of, for example, the implications of AI are astonishing on virtually every business that exists. But yes, there can be step changes. However, the principles of running a business are remarkably simple. One of the things that EOS, and there are other systems out there, but having one operating system to run your business really does make it much more simple. And our whole philosophy is less is more. And when everything is important, nothing is important. So that's and getting across that understanding that actually less is more. So one of the key things that we do within an organization is we'll help people identify what we call their key rocks. And a rock is basically what is it that they've got to achieve in the next 90 days. So we divided the world into a 90-day world. So there's 4 quarters in a year, because we tend to find that most organizations and most people need to come up for air every 90 days. Otherwise, they've kind of forgotten where on earth they're going. And yes, we talk about our business plan for the year, and this is how it's going to be. And you think to yourself in the start of the year, well, I've got plenty of time to catch up. Well, actually, you haven't. If you get off to a bad start, it will then take you 2 months to perhaps catch up to where you need to be. So you're into actually quarter 2 before you know where you are. So what we do is we work very much into a 90-day world, having some key rocks, which are really important that you do. And then the process behind that is we simply every week in a weekly meeting identify whether you're on target or off target. And if you're off target, we said that's called an issue. So you have an issue. So what do we need to address to actually bring you back onto target? And this, as I said earlier, it's all about dealing with the 136 issues that you're grappling with at any one time to ensure that you can actually manage that process. So yeah, running a business is actually quite simple. It's just a question of having a system that is in place to ensure that you can keep it simple.
Yeah, I get that. And this is funny. You reminded me of somebody. I can't remember who said it. It was a TED talk I watched a little while ago, and I'm annoyed at myself because I shared it with some learners not so long ago. And it's a chap that's talking about leadership, just literally his view on leadership, his description of it is, and he has two rules, and one is it's not about you, and the second is it's all about you. It sounds really conflicting, but at the same time, it is about the people you have around you. It is about the teams. It is about your customers, your stakeholders, the environment. This is about everything. But at the same time, if you don't know yourself, then you're going to be in trouble because you're going to miss things. You'll have these massive blind spots. And when I was thinking about blind spots, it took my brain somewhere else around. Actually, there are some entrepreneurs and leaders that I've met and worked with in the past where their ego massively got in the way. And on two levels, actually, there was a lack of it, which was leading to a lack of self-esteem and confidence, and therefore they weren't putting themselves out there. They had a great idea, but they didn't think it was good enough. They never ever thought it was good enough, and therefore didn't talk it up to anybody that probably should have heard about it. And then the flip side of that, it's amazing, I'm brilliant, it can't go wrong. Sort of the damaging, what I would arguably say slightly the more damaging, potentially, version of ego, but sometimes they blag it and get away with it. So yeah, I mean, you talk, no, you don't, but I'm looking on the EOS website, actually, you're talking about humility and that's the humbleness in leadership and entrepreneurialism that is a healthy level of being aware that you can't be all things to all people, and therefore keeping that ego in check, but making sure it's healthy enough to still get you to go out there and feel confident about what you're putting into the world. So roundabout way, long question, very, very rambly. What's your experience of managing both ends of the ego spectrum?
What's my experience of what? Could you just repeat that? Sorry.
Helping people work through that ego spectrum. Yeah. Maybe one example from like the difficult, what I would call the really difficult end, so that I don't want to hear it, possibly not very easy to coach end of that spectrum, through to the lack of confidence, self-esteem, belief in themselves.
Sure. Believe it or not, I'm going to answer it very simply. Data.
Yeah.
Now, you will find that most entrepreneurial businesses, egos get in the way, and subjective judgments about how that business is being forming get in the way. And people say, well, we're doing this and we're doing that, and I'm pretty sure we're doing this, and I think we're doing that.
Pretty sure.
One of the things that, and you know, entrepreneurs are the world's worst, and quite often, when you're an entrepreneur, you're so committed to your business, and you're so convinced it's going to succeed, and you can be very convincing, and indeed you can be very successful. But the art of running a successful entrepreneurial business is understanding your data. Accurate data, and one of the things that we introduce is something we call a scorecard, which are 5 to 15 key metrics that you will have in order to understand where the business is going. That's the kind of the heartbeat of the business. A P&L, profit and loss account, is actually historical. You know, you can't change the past.
It's accounting.
But what we can do is change how it's going. And we we run in our own business a scorecard that monitors those key metrics. So every week, we will look at that scorecard. We will have a target, and we'll have obviously the actual as to where we are. And you will very quickly see over, say, a 13-week, because we divide the year into quarters, over a 13-week period, you can start to see a trend as to whether one of those metrics is going AWOL, as it were. And what then you have to then quickly do is to identify what's going wrong and put it right. And having that pulse, that heartbeat of the business, and understanding exactly where it is, removing all the subjective nonsense that always gets thrown in the way. Well, but if we did this, and but if we did that, all that sort of stuff. These are the actual numbers. This is actually what's going on. And that then starts to, again, bring an entrepreneur down to earth. I recall myself thinking, gosh, this business is going brilliantly well. And I was really happy with a deal that we've done here, a deal we've done there. But when you actually stood back and actually looked at the real numbers,
Yeah.
maybe you've got a problem and you need to deal with that problem, and you need to be, as I say, have that finger on the pulse right away to be able to react quickly. And data, I think, is the greatest way of actually bringing any highly inflated ego down to earth fairly quickly, with a horrible bump at times. But that actually, at the end of the day, a lot of entrepreneurs may not necessarily be financial wizards. They may not have a finance background, but they may be brilliant at creating ideas. And it's that ability to have, again, part of the roles within your leadership team is to have a strong a financial controller, finance director, or whatever, to, again, keep you in check. And certainly in my food business, I had a most wonderful guy who was my right-hand man and really then made all the money side of it happen. As I referred to earlier, you can be great at producing wonderful tasting products. You can be great at selling them, but if you don't look after the money, then of course it's all for nothing. And so that's the key.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, even if you're a small business and literally just setting up, or a solopreneur, ultimately having a good bookkeeper / accountant, and there is a difference between the two, or a bookkeeper that's very helpful in helping you understand your numbers and get behind them and start forecasting a little bit. And so I'm very lucky, actually. She calls herself a bookkeeper, but she was a sort of VA type person before she became that, before she qualified. She's now a qualified accountant, so she's now looking at helping forecast and get me behind my numbers. It's really interesting to get into that headspace. I mean, mine's a lifestyle business. It's not one I want to sell on later down the line. It's literally just to keep things going, and then the rest of it supplement what I don't do within my other job, what I call my proper job. But ultimately, it's a really good idea to have that person in your corner, whether it's, like you say, a financial advisor or a chief financial officer, depending on the size of your organization. The other end of that spectrum, though, those that are struggling to believe in what they've got when everyone else is saying it's brilliant, and that self-belief, that sense, they're kind of maybe suffering from something like imposter syndrome or inferiority complex, that kind of thing. I mean, I know in coaching I come across it a lot in leaders who are in employment, but I think it sometimes also happens with people who are starting a new business, maybe because they've been made redundant or similar, and are trying to set up on their own because they think that's the way to go. And it could well be, but that level of confidence isn't where it should be.
Absolutely. I have a very simple philosophy in life. If you believe you can do something, you will. And if you don't believe it,
you won't. If you believe you can, you can. If you believe you can't, you can't. Yeah, I get it.
I can remember when we were developing our food business, and I've done it in other businesses as well, where I had moments of thinking, this is not going to work. And I remember not sleeping well and all of that sort of stuff. But if you have within your team, and this is when a leadership team, even it could be just 2 people or more, but if within your team you have that conviction that you believe that your product and your business is going to be successful, you almost certainly will be successful. So quite honestly, a lack of belief is probably a good idea to get out, because you're probably in the wrong business if you don't believe in it. Yeah. And I think, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about, fitting your core values. Do you get it? Do you want it? And do you have the capacity to be able to do it? If you aren't convinced by what you're doing, that means you probably don't want it. So therefore, you probably don't fit in into working for you. Then it's probably a very good idea to think very hard as to whether you want to continue to sink money into it. Indeed. So it's all about self-belief. It really is. It's all about self-belief.
It does sound very much like that. There's a simplified version of the Japanese principle of ikigai. Ikigai is much bigger. It's much more complex than people say with that little round infographic that you get. But does the world want it? Is it something you love? Are you great at it? And does it make you money? Beautiful Venn diagram, and in the middle, that's your sweet spot. If you can tick all of say yes to all of those things, brilliant, that's great. But ultimately, if your heart's not in it and you don't want to do it, like you say, you're not likely to put the effort in to make it happen. And that goes for jobs as well as leadership, as well as entrepreneurialism, as well as startups. So it's quite an interesting one. I'm really conscious.
Yeah, it
Sorry.
applies to everything, because I love the way Winston Churchill said, "I'm an optimist. I don't think there's much point in being anything else." And I think that really sums it up in many ways. But of course, you've got to believe in what you're doing.
Yeah, I had a when I had a Twitter account. I don't have it anymore. I think my tagline was "Hopeless optimist. I'll be better at it soon." um,
Yes.
I'm really conscious of where we are on time, and there's a couple of things I want to do. A bit more of a plug about EOS, although we have been talking about it all the way through, which is really great because it's brought some really good examples to life. But also, one bit of advice you would give to somebody who is thinking of starting a business or is already an entrepreneur, moving more into the leadership space. So they've got to a point where they're starting to employ, they're starting to have teams, they're starting to have to lead more than just themselves. What would be your biggest piece of advice for, other than coming to speak to you about EOS? That's a cop out. You're not allowed to do that one. So other than that, what would be the one piece of advice you would give them?
Every business and every team, every individual will hit the ceiling from time to time. And it is that skill of being able to break through the ceiling so that you can go to the next level, whether you're that as an individual, as a team, or as a business. And the art of doing that is either by looking at the certain leadership skills that you have. And we have, EOS has a mechanism by which we can do it. I'm not trying to sell EOS, but
okay, you can do your plug in a minute.
The only thing I would say about EOS is that had I known about it 40 years ago or 35 years ago, I would have been much more successful with all our businesses, because by bringing in an operating system that actually works for your company, your organization, and having one system really changes the way your business works. But every business and everybody will hit the ceiling, and it is that skill to identify that you are hitting the ceiling, and that's normally down to key frustrations like people, lack of growth, lack of profit, lack of control, just trying everything and nothing working. When you feel you're in that position, that is the time then to actually take advice. Very often, one of the things I always enjoy having is a non-executive director who's able to come in and help you look at the business. And what we refer to as working on the business rather than working in the business is really important. So you have to take a couple of steps back. And very often an external assistant, not consultant necessarily, because consultants can often get a very bad reputation for, taking lots of money and telling you all about what you're actually doing and not what you need to do. And that's something that I've seen far too many times, which is the reason why I love what the work that Gino Wickman has done, because he is a lifelong entrepreneur, and he very simply works out. He said, there's no magic pills, there's no silver bullets in what we do and what one does it through EOS or any other operating system. It is simply having that discipline and that structure in your organization to ensure that you can then move forward to the next level. Brilliant. So that's my advice.
Good. There's a tiny plug for EOS in there. But if people want to find out more about EOS or get a copy of Traction, which I assume is available on Amazon and all good book providers somewhere, along with Gino's other books, how would they get in touch with you? What are your links? And we'll put them in the show notes anyway, so we've got something written as well. But what would be the best way to get hold of you?
The best way to get in touch with me is to look at my my website, James, and have a look at or send me an email, james-horne@eosworldwide.com, or go on to eosworldwide.com /James Horne. And you can see a little bit about what I am and what I've done and my background and whether I can help you. And what we do is we'll give you a 90-minute free discussion. We'll take you through EOS. Our principle is to, be humble, and we always about help first is one of our core values. Do the right thing is another, and so on. So we're not here to try and sell you a system. We will talk to you about how EOS works how it might fit for your organization, equally we can identify whether it doesn't. So we've gone, and you've also got to decide whether you actually like the person that's going to be teaching you and helping you and coaching you through that process. So that's also vital.
Absolutely.
So contacting me through eosworldwide.com is the best way to get hold of me.
Brilliant. And I do love that final note around being coached through something, because it's obviously that's something that plays direct to my playbook, is the power of coaching and mentoring and what it can do, and enabling, like I say, with the work you do with people, that they're using this process, they're using a system, and there's a lot of giveaways in here. I've got to say, it's almost like a handbook in itself.
Absolutely.
But to have somebody holding your hand and helping you and cheerleading and helping and pointing out where maybe you're interpreting things in a way that isn't quite how it was intended, or it seems to suit you at the time, but actually there's a different way to look at it. It's lovely to have that kind of extra set of eyes and ears and thinking partner to help you through that. So a really, really great approach. Thank you so much, James. This has been an absolute joy. So many nuggets of wisdom and helpful stuff in there. So I do hope that people will enjoy this one. If you do, you will enjoy it. When you enjoy this, do hit subscribe. There is a whole season coming on leadership, and this is just the first of many. So thank you again, James. And
thank you,
to all listening, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.